Well, thank you, Indrik. Thank you very much. And thank you all of you for being here, for coming here. It's my first time in Estonia, but sun is shining and I can see my hotel from the lecture hall and I can see the university from my hotel. This is quite astonishing. I really don't know where to begin, but a bit of biography might help, because what I'm going to present to you will be perhaps uncommon to some of you, because it may be coming across as a mixture of, social philosophy and cognitive science and things like that, that don't seem much to relate to the study of religion. But that's where I have come, and I have a very traditional background in the history of religions, old school. Okay, where first I had a degree in Latin and Greek, then I studied classical Arabic, Hebrew, Phoenician and Ugaritic, and that's just about as classical as you can get, staying in that sort of hemisphere. I never did Pali, Sanskrit or Japanese, but I have great admiration for people who do real classical philological groundwork, okay, which is, you can call it field work in the history of ideas or civilizations and whatever. Very basic. This just means that my philosophical or my theoretical reflections are not sort of just floating or hovering in free air. When I left the university a few years ago, I'd been talking for about 40 years on these issues. I was teaching and teaching and teaching. I was teaching first term undergraduates, and I was in a very small college where I had to teach a very broad load. But as I'm a curious person, and it's my curiosity that brought me into the study of the history of religions, I was happily doing so. So I've done courses on Eskimo religion, Maori religion, Roman religion, Hinduism, if you may call it that these days, and things like that. So I've been all over the place, not been a specialist in many of these things, but I'm, generalizing in the sort of thing. So one student, a very critical student, came up to me one day in one of my first years of teaching and said, well, now you teach this class on that religion, and the last term it was that, and they sort of, look alike. Is that because they really are alike, or it's because it's you who are teaching us? Says, well, I'll give that a thought. And that's what I've been doing ever since. So much for critical students. I don't know where he is now, but he did a great job at that. So I started doing the sort of cross-cultural, cross-disciplinary, cross-whatever that we used to, where I come from, to call the phenomenology of religions. Had nothing to do with experience or Husserl or all of that, but just the phenomena. It's from the old ideas of Chantepie de la Saussaye and that school. Okay, so you take all these phenomena of human religious life and civilization and see what are they? What are the components, different kinds of myths and rituals and all that. So that's what I'm thinking of when I say phenomenology of religion. And as a matter of fact, the book there with the tree on the left side of the slide is really a phenomenology of religion in that sense. It's about all the stuff that goes into what we normally call religion. We have the word, and what is the stuff that we are then using the word with and on, okay? There is an Italian edition on the market of this, Che cosa è la religione, if you prefer that. And there is a French edition coming next year, I think. So I think I've sort of stated my point there. And I really like Jonathan Z. Smith. Now I'm coming closer to my presentation. I read all of his stuff. I met the guy. I even wrote things in honor of him, here, there, and well, it's a few things. I think he taught us so much. So this is actually, in a certain sense, in honor of him. I say, oh, you're right, we are imagining religion. Because we are humans and we can imagine, and we are scholars, so we can imagine certain things in special ways, because we are trained to imagine in special ways. I remember once I was teaching in a class in the University of Vermont, Burlington, and I was talking about some of this theoretical stuff, and one of the students came up to me and said, why do you have to talk about, theory of religion? We know what religion is from home. That's in America. In Denmark, it's slightly different. In many places of the world, there is a lot of religion, but not so much of the study of religion. But in Denmark, the study of religion is considered to be something that is constitutive of ordinary culture or Bildung, if you will. You need to know something about this, not perhaps for your own religious edification, but in order to understand something about humanity, history, culture, and so on. So I will claim, and I will substantiate my claim, that there is something out there. It's not all just imagination. So let's get started. Mapping deontic grids in social ontologies, it sounds a bit smart, but I've really thought about this. I'm going to explain to you what it is that I'm trying to not hide, but to elicit from this. Methodological considerations, yes, let's talk about that, and let's talk about the comparative study of religion. I know some will say, I'm not a comparativist, I study only the Gospel of Mark. Okay, I have colleagues who said that. So I said, so what do you do? Well, I study early Mark and late Mark and influences from, So you're not comparative? Okay, I think we're all comparative. All we have to is to agree and see what we can learn from that. Deontic grids, deontic has to do with, I'll go into it, but it has to do, for a start, to do with duties, things that we have to do and not have to do in our daily lives, to be human beings. And grids. It really refers here, I should have perhaps referred more directly to Mary Douglas, who is one of my great heroes. Mary Douglas and Emil Durkheim and Ludwig Wittgenstein are behind this. Perhaps I should have pointed it out, but they are, okay? They are my guiding spirits in this adventure. So it's a constructive response to Jonathan D. Smith, all we have is maps. Yes, 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 but. Well, he said maps are all we have. I said, really? There must be maps of something, or they would be just fiction. Something that could be written by Borges or someone, a scholar, yeah. So I would say that scholars can find, map and compare all matters where language is involved, okay? They can probably also, zoologists and so on, can find other things, but what we are doing in the humanities is finding and comparing matters where language is involved. Scholars know that religions are social constructions, formations of behavior, and so are the studies and the mappings of them. And just ask Stephen Engler. He's here with us, so we can ask Stephen. He's written some beautiful things about social constructionism. And social constructions aren't just anything airy-fairy or so. I mean, it's money, it's power, it's whatnot, it's borders between countries and so on. I need say no more. So how do we map and compare social constructions? using a couple of philosophies that have been a great inspiration to me. That's Karl Popper and John Searle. I will present something as a sort of solution. Scholars of religion study religious worlds, socio-cultural creations produced on the basis of collective intentionalities because people agree on certain things. They think similarly on some issues and differently, but they can only disagree because they somehow agree to a certain point. Let's leave it there. Everywhere we find human behavior and human patterned behavior, this is patterned behavior as well. From making noises in language to dancing, playing football, making paellas or something that people do and where they can agree on and say, well, this is not really this is not a pizza, it's a fruit tart, or something like that. So religion belongs, I would say, in the category of patterned behavior. And now what makes it special then? And that is one fundamental question. We may talk more about this. Some preliminary ideas here help us get there. Some of the ideas are familiar to many of you, but I think that perhaps not all ideas are familiar to all of you. So if you have any, question along the way for a term or a word or a concept, just let's know about it. In 2018, Kevin Shilbrach noted about the definition of religion. I'd like to quote him because, well, he's a good friend of mine and I think he's a sensible person. We don't have quite the same background, but we can talk anyway. If one defines religion as a set of practices, belief in super-empirical realities, statements like religion existed in ancient Egypt can be true. To be sure, the word religion, like all words, is the product of a certain time and place. But the fact that there were practices predicated on beliefs and so on in what we now call ancient Egypt is not the invention of scholars. The concept is there for coherent and analytical use for social ontology, like this is right, then religion can name a social reality that existed. And that for me sort of closes the issue, unless something comes up as formulated really cogently and rationally and so on. I might listen to it, but this is fine with me. One can be both reflexive and a realist, a scholar of both religion and religion. So perhaps this is somewhere in between the total deconstruction and total, So what are religious practices that we may study them? What are the objects of any study and that we may speak of them? Here's Karl Popper's three worlds idea. Some of you have heard about that before, some of you have heard terrible things about it. He has been ridiculed by some philosophers and neglected by others, but I think this idea is very useful when you study things like social ontology and collective intentionality and things that humans do. He used the world 1, 2, and 3 terminology. It could have been called something else. Before World War II, there were German philosophers who talked about Reich, eins, zwei und drei, das dritte Reich, but you cannot say that after the Second World War. So he had to change the terminology in English. So he could call it sphere or something. There's the material world, and there's the mental world with mental objects. Somewhere along in evolution, the mental worlds arose. Cognitive science and psychology study mental objects. They're making great strides, also in the study of animals. Well, cultural objects are products of the human mind and behavior. Religion, for example. A product of the human mind, that is, take, for example, a song of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. They have written quite a number of songs. You may even know some of them. I shall not start humming or whistling, but you may know some of them. The point is that they could sing, they could play instruments, they could play, sing, and compose together to make the melody, the harmony, and the words fit beautifully into a certain cultural matrix. They could write it down. Not only could they record it so that others could hear it, but they could write it down so that I have a Beatles songbook at home. That's why I'm talking about this stuff. They could write it down so that others in posterity, including me, could actually look at the words and the chords and the notes and everything and recreate what they had in mind, okay? So there, the cultural object of what they had in mind becomes publicly available for those who are so inclined, okay? As for ontology here, Popper had problems with ontologists, people who are interested in what's real and not real. And there are people out there who think that tables are not real, but they're only subatomic particles and things. But I'll stick to the manifest image, our everyday ontology, that there are ants, dogs, people, furniture, football, and so on. And then changing the subject slightly and saying that religion is, of course, not a thing in the world. It's not a thing in the material world. It can manifest itself in the material world, but it's a semantic space. So religion is the word, but what is the object, if there is one? It's an epistemic object, an object of our intentionality and of our thinking and of our knowledge. That's what meant by epistemic. And a semantic space, referring to an objective range of human behavior and, in our knowledge, of course, an epistemic space of behavior. And when you study religion from day one, you will be extending your epistemic space of behavior. When you have a new class, a new book, a new article, whatever, you expand your epistemic space. So most World 3 objects are human-made, as are religions. About 20 years ago, I was spending some time at the University of Georgia in Athens in the US. And I was interviewed to the student newspaper, and they put me on the front page. And they say, religion is a human invention, says Denmark professor. Wow. Okay. Some people think that studying religion is just peaceful, quiet, and academic. Who cares? And not quite. And they couldn't call me a Danish professor because that means a piece of cake in the US. So that was it. Right. So there are ontological objects in the world. There are rocks. There are mental in the mind things, and there are objects in World 3. And this is where John Searle enters the picture with institution, where X counts as Y. That is something like, one of his famous examples is money. This is money, okay? I can use that here. I cannot use it in Denmark because we don't have the euro as currency. So it depends, of course, on where you are. In some places, it is. X counts as Y, paper counts as money. So if you make up social ontologies with deontic powers, you have to pay me this or that, duties, right, obligations, privileges, rewards, and punishments. That's what social life essentially consists of, okay? You have to navigate that. And Popper, again, he says that these institutions are World 3 products. Social ontologies, which is a recent term, that exist in and as socio-cultural artifacts, like Lennon and McCartney's songs. This is how we may study Middle Pharaonic religion, okay? Well, 3 existed and can be the objects of study. If you take the time and the effort to study ancient Egyptian language and hieroglyphs and stuff, you can actually learn to read what the Egyptians had in mind. That's no small feat. However, with time and translation, reconstruction processes, these lose their deontic processes. The ancient social ontologies, that religious life in ancient Egypt, becomes the stuff of our epistemological stuff. From their reality, it becomes our knowledge. That's the point. They're interesting, perhaps, but they do not govern our lives. The difference is one of normativity. And this, of course, has to do with theories about Lebenswelt, Kant, Husserl, and all this. And a good friend of mine, William Payton, okay, Religious Worlds, that little book, I used that in teaching for years. I thought it was absolutely the best book you could get then. So, how do you find religion? This is actually what cognitive scientists would call a framing problem. How do you know what to look for? How do your eyes recognize a chair? That's what cognitive scientists are studying. Ours is slightly higher level framing problems. Sacralization is the key, I would say. USPs, ultimate sacred postulates, are made by humans by Durkheim and Rappaport. Those are my guiding inspirations. Language, culture, and religions must be learned. Searle's X counts as Y must also be learned. But how? And this is what I've been working on for the past few years. Humans have double vision. You don't notice it, okay? When you're looking at things, you don't notice any binocular rivalry between your left and your right eye. It all comes together effortlessly in your brains. And we have a double vision. We have complementary learning theories, 2 pathways into the brain, one that's hippocampal and one that's prefrontal. This is becoming a bit physiological, but mind you, it's interesting for what we're doing. That is, that children are very important in the study of religion because they will become the bearers of religion to their children and so on. So their children are extremely important. They learn to see things as something. And this is where Wittgenstein also comes into the picture, because he said that humans don't just see things, they see things as something. They see things as pure, impure, holy, unholy, and important, unimportant, and so on. Okay? So I have 8 grandchildren, and one of them, as a little girl, as about 1.5 years old, 18 months on, when I introduced something to her, her first question would be, is it dangerous? Dangerous? No? So that is how children and we all, and this is a lifelong process, okay? When you grow up, you learn things about the tax department. That could be dangerous for some, in some ways. So we are constantly learning to see that as something, okay? And if you were brought up in one of the religious cultural traditions where there is a much emphasis on purity, for instance, you will certainly learn this in very concrete ways. We have a double vision because we can think slow. That's a very special ability that humans have. No one has yet figured out how it works, but the thing is that we can think slow. The electrochemical processes in the brain work very quickly, fast. But we can use cognitive anchors and symbols. Okay? So, and then we can talk about things, discussions with a very long time span and so on. It's different for dogs. Humans can have metacognition about their own thoughts. I can think about we can all think about our own thoughts. And we can have normative cognition, cognition that is governed without our knowledge, really, of how we should think, being where we are and who we are. And so humans can have sacralized cognitive objects. You can have crucifix or whatever. You can have objects that are cognitive, that you perceive, that you cognize, and that are sacralized. Okay? Of course, this objective social ontology derives from individual, and collective intentionality. That's what I've just tried to explain, how humans have these peculiar, very special abilities. And I would say that the ideas of founders and reformers are prime examples of how individual intentionalities transform into collective joint shared intentionality. The teachings of the Buddha, Buddhist writings contain a lot about what the Buddha said. And the Buddha said something about what he'd been thinking. Thoughts that had appeared to him, so to speak, were awakening. And the teachings of the Buddha, they shape collective intentionality in Buddhist life worlds. When young boys and some girls in Buddhist countries come to the monasteries, for a better word, to be members of the Sangha, they learn to think in certain ways. And for example, in the Catholic world, you have the principle of St. Francis that deposited in objective plans, models of and for norms, rules, and monastic practice. There are rules about the monastic order, instituted, related to St. Francis. And so now some people will say, especially my students, well, that's not true. But that doesn't matter. Truth is what you make of it. On veracity and how if devotees think that Moses, Muhammad, Teresa and others had visions or auditions, then that suffices to hold the relevant reflective beliefs and act of them. So I do this or that because someone said or did this or that. Okay. Now, how many Muslims have been to hell? Probably not that many. If they are there, they haven't come back yet. So the messages in the Quran serve as collective, joint and shared intentionality for more than 1 billion humans. Because when I speak to and with Muslims, we don't have to talk long before we start talking about the fire, hell, and matters like that. So religion is for sharing. I did a lecture in the IHR Erfurt Congress in 2015. That's a good 10 years, 11 years from now. About, the topic was cloning minds. So a bit more on Searle's status functions. He says, and now we're slowly turning into one of Stephen's favorite areas, this philosophy of language. Because language is how we do all this. We may have some cognitive, biological, and psychological, whatever, competences, but what really gets this to fly is language. The ultimate tool, 5 forms of illocutionary speech acts: assertives, directives, commissives, expressives, declarations. Declarations are performative and create what they describe. This is interesting. Declaring someone queen or king, then this person will be what they are so declared. Declaring 2 humans a married couple, they acquire a new status. They are now a married couple. And religious discourse works like that. Objects are made special, sacralized. Cows in India are sacred. They have been so declared. All in the world that is clean or unclean, holy or not, moral, immoral, has been so declared. as a function of ritual or other social activity. Okay. The basic formula is the same. Declarations which pretend to be assertives. That is how religions are made up as comparable objects for analysis. Now we're getting to the objects of study. And here are some ideas I think I'd like to share with you on linguistic twitching. How religious discourse works semantically, how it works in language, and how it works in mind, cognitively. Religious language twists linguistic forms. Declarations may work as assertives, directives, and here's the example. NN is our savior. That's a declaration. NN is our savior. Can be turned into an assertive. This is our savior. It's no special declaration. That's just how the world is. NN is our savior. A directive, honor our savior. A commissive, I make a vow to our Saviour, and expressing we love our Saviour, and so the imagined Saviour or world is made real as an epistemic object in social ontology. This is how this imagined world is made real. There was some 20 years ago a fairly overlooked book on precisely that. I'll come back to that. Linguistic twitching, religious discourse present matters imagined as if they were matters observed. The miracles of saints and the wonders of gurus may be referred to as evidence as the falling rain. Okay? So it's very convincing. Religious discourse, I would claim, is elliptical. It leaves out the we declare that. And present the status of NN as irrefutable and observable fact of practical realism. And practical realism means that thinking like those around you. And this linguistic twitching moves ordinary perception and discourse. Ordinary perception and discourse has a fit to the world. It's raining outside. When I say this, it must fit the circumstances. It's raining outside. That's what I'm saying. Religious language has what I would call inverted intentionality, describing not how things are, but how the discourse wants the world to be, as the world as wished for. Religious discourse tends to hide this when blending assertive and referential language with the imagining, requesting, and demanding language of world-making. Religious ideologies contain plans for living. They refer to the past, but they are for future use. World-making is future-oriented. This is what you must do, you should think, and it produces social ontologies for humans to inhabit, and so they are simultaneously and inevitably political. For all this to work, it must be objective and learnable, objectivized as something that can be known to the participants. Okay. You cannot make up a religious world and say, well, this is so sacred, no one knows about it and no one's ever going to hear about it. That's not how you make a sacred world. Sorry. So we have some case studies here. The complex classic Indic Varnish Ramadharma system is a case in point, pointing to caste, gender, age group, and other details of deontic importance when mapping anyone's rights and duties. The Islamic Sharia and Tahara systems, purity system, Jewish culinary rules and all similar systems are built on the X counts as Y. What is pure, impure? Rules and norms are related to the declarations, creating the status function of most items in their cosmology. So if you are familiar with a Jewish household, Orthodox Jewish household, and the rules for where things are placed and how they are handled, you will know this. If you don't know and you try to look it up or meet some. The deontic functions are related in more or less systemic clusters. What is a gift for some may be a loss for others. Okay? These deontic functions of who must do what, they form deontic grids, and it's a term I've invented. I think it's a good term. You may too, you may not. We can talk about that. In institutions that provide epistemic knowledge objects, they demonstrate how practitioners of religious traditions organize their complex classifications of social action in thought and practice. I know this is what I'm trying to present as a basis for comparative religion. Okay, we could compare religious ideas and discourses, and this is more on the institutional, practice, behavioral level. So these complex deontologies, these systems of rules constituted by institutions, could be the territories where scholars may make analysis of socio-cultural universals such as right, duties, obligation, and so on. You will not find any religious system without these ideas in it. Rights, duties, obligations, requirements, and so on. Some have very many and very detailed, some have few. These are the object, the social matters, the kinds of knowledge and emotional regulations and so the members of the group in question must adopt, the deontology. Literate traditions may have formally certified experts how to administer them, but you don't need a literate traditions. You can have others. Well, I am familiar with some studies of some Southern and Eastern African traditions where most of human life is governed by the ancestors, right? So you will have to know about what the ancestors think and want and so on to make life work. The idea here is that, and this is good for us as students, outsiders may come to know more than insiders. Aha! Anyone who wants to learn the language may learn what insiders must know. That's possible for outsider scholars as well. I see a trend now where some students want to get good grades by doing things as smoothly as possible. So they do not go through philological training anymore, and they find their empirical fieldwork on the computer, and they ask simple questions. I think this is a real danger to our field, but that's just something I think I've noted. That's one reason you study that. You could actually become an expert in something that was otherwise the field of somebody else. You know what I mean? What insiders must know. What I didn't tell you was that after my studies of the different languages, I was mainly teaching in Islamic studies for quite a number of years. Okay, so I'm fairly familiar with these things. And I know that I can discuss with people who have these ideas, convictions, be they lay people or trained imams and so on. There are things that the study of religion maps, plenty of materials that we can, and so on. There are actual people out there doing actual things, and it's all objective as culture. Clifford Geertz writing about one of my favorite articles ever to read was this about culture as a system of symbols. Human culture and religion must be visible, tangible, and objective to remain learnable. In our minds, we have mental maps of matters that do not exist in the material world, but they can be made objective as World 3 objects. So what do you think of? Then someone asked me, well, I can put it on paper, and then it becomes a World 3 objective matter, cultural matter. I think Smith was overstating his point. All we have is maps. I mean, that's an epistemological truism, but that does not mean all our knowledge is similarly or totally unfettered. And I think the very history of our discipline, the intersubjective academic and scientific communities in the study of religion, demonstrates this. There's no reason to despair. So perhaps this whole presentation is superfluous. Somehow we all know it. But these are just minor details, sort of embellishing the picture. Comparative analysis of Deontic grid, making maps of what they must know. The scholars' comparative analysis provide the maps of how religious traditions and so on organize human existence in the webs of rights and duties, permissions and punishments and rewards. The Deontic grids are a value-laden class of the webs of signification that humans spin in their making of their life worlds. They are easy to spot and easy to map because we as humans can actually recognize this. You travel to some totally unknown place on the planet and somebody says, oh, don't go there, you know. Say, what, don't go there? No, because, and so on, you get an explanation. You'll say, this is religion, you know, somehow, okay? It's about privileges, obligations, permissions, prohibitions, and so on. Rules, roles, taboos, blessings, make up the fabric of social interaction, and so on. And I would say these are valuable topics for any kind of non-invasive field work. I have a colleague who was doing non-invasive field work among Zulu people in South Africa. And what he would do then was to say, well, if I want to be married, if I want to be married, what should I do? Well, you must do such and such and such. Could I do? No, you can't do that. You have to do that first. And so there are rules and entitlements and prohibitions of such and such. And ultimately that had to do with something that was certainly religious because it had to do with superhuman beings and their doings. Non-invasive field work, you can do that easily. It takes a bit of training, but it's not difficult. So we're getting closer to the end of this. Making maps of what they must know. Making maps of what they must know. Humans have the unique capacity for normative cognition. If they can learn what they should do and not should do, I can learn the same. I can just listen. And if I know the language, it's even better. Perhaps a few years of field work or marrying into a family and so on. I had a student who married into a Chinese family in China. And he came back and he said, well, it's interesting with Chinese cosmology because everything means something else, okay? There's all these analogies of what corresponds to this in medicine and in cosmology and so on. Now they even have a car that's called a pole star, which is silly because in Chinese cosmology, the pole star is the only one thing that doesn't move. Shouldn't work well for a car. Now, enculturated humans can cognize norms, rules, and values. We can all learn this. And that's what we are trying to teach our students. That is, you can learn this. Oh, yes. There is plenty of sociocultural territory to make maps of with relentless self-scrutiny. And we're back to Jonathan G. Smith here. And the epistemologies, which comes down to map making, to use and make sense of their ontologies, their institutional territories, when studying their deontic grids. It's just us as scholars in the history or study of religion, and they can be some of our own, but actually it's they whom we study. We don't just study ourselves. But in order to be good students of what others do, we need to study ourselves as well, relentlessly self-critical. Please consider the examples here as indications of how the philosophies of language and religion may merge with cognitive science, anthropology, social psychology, sociology. It's a neat package and you're welcome to pass it on. And I think it will be made available somehow, somewhere in some shape for us as a group, at least. So, mapping deontic grids and comparative analysis of deontic grids, how we make sense, enabling, in any analysis we'll look for the hidden grammars, because these institutional arrangements all have certain kinds of grammar. If you do this, you should do that, and comparing to imperative and subjunctive and whatnot. In any analysis, you will find constraints. I'm here inspired by a Cuban philosopher, Alicia Guerrero, who's talking about enabling, regulating, and restricting constraints. Just Google Guerrero, it's interesting. Any rule-governed activity that counts as something has institutions as its grammar system. Institutions can be mapped. You can map the institutions by analyzing the behavior. If you analyze certain kinds of behavior and or speech cleverly enough, you will discover behind them certain systematic properties, just as you see with Ferdinand de Saussure's ideas about language as a system, a langue, and as an articulation in parole. So for every parole, for every articulation of something, there will be a corresponding system somewhere, okay? And now, for myself, being a person who spent some time learning languages, I must say that I have the greatest respect for a special German theologian who went to Greenland in the 17th century, Greenland 17th century, and worked out the first grammar of the Inuit language. Samuel Kleinschmidt, okay, that was his name. It's amazing, you know. Have you been to Greenland? I've been to Greenland. Have you been to places where you don't understand a word? Yes, you probably have. And just imagine going to a place like that and trying to work out what is the hidden grammar about the ways that people speak. That's really, when people say, what's in the humanities, you know? We don't need the humanities in the university anymore. So come on. I mean, these are some of the things that I think are really, really important. My colleague Armin Geertz, some of you may know Armin Geertz. He studied the Hopi religious communities in his earlier days, and he collected songs and tales and things. And it was very difficult for him to translate it because there wasn't really any dictionary. So he started out making his own dictionary. Okay, he had to do that. And it was in the very early days of computing. And the university had a computer department with some big machines. And so he plugged some of his stuff in there, and out came some sheets of paper with strange signs on them. And the computer guys thought there was something wrong with the computers. But Armin said, no, this is how I need to transcribe it. I think that's brilliant. There is really something commendable to field work, to groundwork, you know, to really face the problems that you meet when you when you want to transgress your own borders, because that is what you do when you move out of your comfort zone and you start studying religion or anthropology. But let's stick with religion, because there's double jeopardy there, because you, first of all, you have to step out of your own world and you have to explain to others in your own world why you would study that other world, okay? So, any rule-governed activity that counts as something has institutions as its grammar system. So if people do something that you find a bit odd, you can, through non-invasive field work, find out what it refers to. So institutions can be mapped, okay? Religious institutions can be mapped. I personally think that's interesting. You may focus on other aspects of the study of religion, but so I'm quoting Jonathan C. Smith. Well, let's get to work. And in the work, when the process we took to ask, cui bono, whose interests are really, playing out here? And I know that there's been a lot of interest in the last few decades in the study of religion about power issues. And I think that, the study of institutions and the question of cui bono can get us a long way there. Yes, Deontic grids. I was trying to make a model of it, a graphic model, but I haven't gotten this far. I haven't gotten much further than that. If I come up with something really useful, I will send it to Indrik and he could distribute it to us. But what I wanted to do is to just illustrate how all these things come together. We all of us know that we are in our lives in different roles and different situations, from being a retired professor to being a younger student to being whatnot. And we have different roles that we should fulfill as well as we can. And with that comes certain obligations and certain rights. I don't have to go to department meetings, okay? I spent a lot of my life in department meetings as head of department and all those things. I don't have to do that anymore. That's a privilege, okay? And so on. Anyone of you familiar with the Hindu or Indian tradition, the Manu's Book of Laws? Yes, you are. That's interesting reading. Then someone will say, yes, but no one follows these rules. The ideas are there. So that was in my first paper there on the history of religions without an object. How can you study something that doesn't have a reference group, says the anthropologist or the sociologist? Well, we are working primarily in the work of ideas, of thoughts. But then sometimes we also see how these thoughts are being sedimented or crystallized in the social world. And that's what I'm trying to do with the idea of institutions and their deontic powers. So, thank you.
Now we have quite some time for questions.
We should have.
Who's the most eager to start?
Questions, comments, yes?
I'll give it to James.
Thank you very much for that. I'm thinking about the idea of deontic grids and the fieldwork researcher and so on. In my experience, for example, in Australia, one of the duties or one of the obligations is secrecy. And so when one would want to penetrate inside from outside, it's forbidden, and that's a rule and enforced. How would you deal with that? Interpret that in terms of your Deontic grid, because it actually is a duty of secrecy.
Yes. It's an all-pervasive duty.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, if you're a researcher, fieldwork scholar, anthropologist, it can of course pose some problems. It's like that joke from American anthropology. You know, you ask, "What is a good Indian?" You know, okay. So it's well, that's a practical problem. Yes, it is.
And that also, in some cases, has been written about indigenous methodologies and so on, that the researcher goes in and is actually not given the truth, is in a sense deceived, in order that the outsider will not really penetrate to the inside.
Well, one can understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And
So,
one other point, if I could just make, and this is about when you collect stories and myths and that sort of thing, and rituals, and write about them, put them into text. It seems to me it fundamentally changes it, because ritual and storytelling is often performative and depends on the context, the situation, depends on the audience and what's actually going on. And although you can put it in a text, it won't be living in that same way.
yes.
So those are just my...
Well, it's a fair question, of course. But see, I think getting the text will be perhaps, or some photographs, or a video, or some, is perhaps to give, you know, if you want to convey an idea of what it's like to somebody who has never been there. That's, I mean, being a teacher, you know something, and you want to pass it on to a student who does not yet know that something. It's of course, it's a translational problem. It is. And you're absolutely right. But I think that, I remember from my own days as a student, I was going through a course on Inuit as Eskimo shamanic rituals. And what we had in the classroom, we were very few students, but you know, it was nothing like the lodge where these seances would be performed, but just having the recordings in writing of, we got some idea of what was going on. But of course, it's a poor rendition of but I would just say that we have now many more media, technologies for representation. You know? So I think I can remember when I was a young assistant professor. I was visiting in the Netherlands, in the University of Groningen. I was visiting a center for visual something where they had actual photographs of something from, you know, Africa and Indonesia and things. Today, nobody needs to go to Groningen to see a photograph of something from Indonesia. You can get it online. So things have changed. Some years ago, this is about 40 years ago or so, I was trying to edit a little book about religious minorities in the Middle East, the ones that are sometimes being persecuted by ISIS and others. And it was very difficult to find. Actual material, you know, about or from these religious groups. But now they're online. They have some of them have a center of something in Berlin, in Germany, and if you're in Australia, and you want to know, your students want to know what's actually this thing about the Yazidis in Syria. Oh, all right. That's, you know, something like that. It's amazing.
Thanks, Stephen. Another question?
Thanks, Jeppe. I enjoyed that. I really like your idea of deontic grids. And I totally agree with you about the critique of Jonathan Z. Smith there. And I think, in some ways, this idea of religion as solely the imagination of the scholar's study has become a kind of rod on our backs, actually. But I wondered, what wasn't clear to me in your presentation is quite where religion fits into this Deontic grid map, because it seems to me that Deontic grids could work very nicely, as you really partly showed, in all kinds of institutions. And which ones are actually religious or not seems to me the weakest point of the model. I mean, I'm an amateur football, not an amateur football, I'm a supporter of Scottish second division football team where I live. Now, Scottish second division football is pretty grim, right? But there are definite rules about how you should behave as a spectator. And we know also, all of which, aspects of your Deontic grid fit onto nicely. Now, we know there's also been papers about how football really is a religion, all that kind of thing. But it seems to me that, to cut my point short, the Deontic grid is a much stronger map of human social institutions and behavior, and religion remains opaque to me as quite where it fits in or where it's demarcated in your approach.
Deontic grid plus USP. Doesn't write. I'm trying. No, it's okay. Deontic grid plus USP ultimate sacred postulates in the spirit of Roy Rappaport. Equals religion somehow. So you're right, because Deontic grids, yes, for football fans and football players and all kinds of, yes. I have recently written something about normative cognition, and there, as an example of rules, I take the game of cricket, and the British Book of Rules for cricket come to about 440 pages. Rules for the, yes. So, and of course, Deontic, this is what our entire legal, political, economic, whatever systems are built on. The point is just that what to some people 100 years ago looked like primitive societies, for instance, they have just, perhaps not as many, but they have Deontic grids as well. They've had many of those. But they were perhaps not so obvious, so easy, especially for an anthropologist rushing in with a translator, staying there 3 weeks and going back and writing a couple of monographs about it, which is amazing anyway. But there are. Every human society is infused, permeated, undergirded, whatever, with rules. And that's where my respect for Mary Douglas comes in.
If I could just very quickly follow up, well, I'm not convinced that ultimate sacred postulates is a gripping or analytically tractable in a granular way concept to dig into that. I think I think that's where questions about historical and cultural formation of the category religion have to be taken into account.
Well, so the more broader Durkheimian vision would be things that are sacred, sacralized, set apart, inviolable, and things like that. But this was the best I could do here, because I thought that what this would be what most of the people in the audience would be familiar with. And so, but should I write this out somehow? I think I could actually write a book about this if it were, because it needs so many references and digressions and all that. Yeah.
I will give it the next question, but I have a follow-up on that myself too. I think much of the problem or the aspect of discussion here also is how do we determine which concept is empirically tractable?
I would say that depends on what you're working with. Yes. And you may perhaps be doing you may be doing really poor work. That is, of course, if your concepts and your ideas simply do not fit the world or the place where you would like to study something. So in a certain way, it's a trial and error process. And it works because we have a community of academically dedicated scholars working on, so I remember years ago, there was somebody telling me about Hinduism, about the fulfillment hypothesis. That was a theological idea that Hindus were, just as decent people as Anglican and so on, but they just still needed to recognize Jesus as their savior. I think that is totally off the mark. And it says a lot about the people who are talking about this, but very little about the people they want to talk about. So that will be just an example of, so it's not popular anymore. And a good 100 years ago, there was a very influential hypothesis or theory in the study written about pan-Babylonianism, okay? Everything originated in Babylonia. So you could explain everything just by telling how you could trace it back to Babylonia. I mean, in 100 years, people may find, the transactions of this meeting and say that, oh, these guys were. So, but maybe we're also coming closer to the truth, and we know how things really are. And so we need not study anymore.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your presentation, the multidisciplinary aspects.
Oh, yes,
I struck up to understand Samuel Kleinsmith.
Oh, yes.
And I compare, the moment you said about Samuel, I compare with the Bartholomew Ziegenbach. I come from Karnataka, southern part of India.
Yes.
I live in Germany.
Okay. Yeah.
So I compare with both missionaries. So 17th century when Ziegenbach came, and I appreciate his dedication, his tears and sweat and blood, the way he wrote dictionaries. But in 17th century, our Adivasi communities, Dalits, women, tribals do not have education. One side I really admire at him, his dedication. Once in a year we celebrate Missionaries Day.
Okay.
We salute them.
Okay.
But who were the audience to learn from these lexicons? Who were the readers where Dalit communities and indigenous communities were not supposed to get education? So for whose sake these dictionaries were written? Are methodologies teaching to the marginalized communities, or methodologies originated from the marginalized communities? This is a struggle I'm going through. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. Yes. Who are you actually working for? I remember from certain dictionaries about, say, anthropology, that Malinowski wrote that Malinowski said that anthropologists should be educated in great numbers because they were very good for the colonial administration. Isn't that nice? You can tell your students where they can find a job. Of course, things have changed, but I think talking about this Danish-German missionary, part of their mission was actually to they believed that they truly believed that the Inuit people, the Eskimos, would benefit from being able to write in their own language. And then, of course, this was because then they could also preach the gospel, okay, in the Inuit language and translate the Bible. Translating the Bible was just the biggest thing, because then they would be greeted in heaven when they returned. So, but this is just an example of how people's beliefs actually move them. In most mundane places in the world, people are moved around in their life because of the belief they have about what is right and what is wrong. But then sometimes there are people who, like gurus or whatever, And then they can be judged in their own time for their motives and their deeds. But sometimes it takes some time before you can actually see it, what it was that they were doing.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I think it's very interesting to put social ontology as a research object, and also the question of a deontic grid. I think it's very appealing. I have a comment and a question. So I really love that you started with the idea that maybe it's interesting to not only talk about people talking. I really like that. And I'm coming from practice theory. I have a practice theory approach. And then since you were talking about rules in different religion, and also about cognitive science, I think that's very applicable. I think it's also interesting to think about how things like how these rules are not only known like cognitively, not only in language, but also by embodied and embedded knowledge. So the body knows the rule. And then since practice is messy and changing all the time. Now, this is the question. I'm wondering, because if you are mapping the deontic grid, this somehow freezes the moment, right? Also, how the bodily knowledge and the language knowledge. And then, of course, this must change over time with each new generation or new technology, or because of like social change. So I'm wondering, like, how can we use the deontic grid and then still pay attention to the changes, to how is it adaptable to change?
Yes. Well, that's why Ferdinand de Saussure, the Swiss linguist, is one of my great heroes. He made this very simple distinction that no one had really done before him. He didn't even publish it himself. It was done by his students. About the articulation, the speech, in French called parole, and the system of language, called the langue. Okay, and I think we have the same distinction in human behavior. In human practice. So you can say that people are performing, say, weddings differently, especially now in these days, with inspirations from American TV and film, and so people are getting married everywhere in this strange, but they're still getting married, right? So they're still articulations, these weird performances. I see, a couple being married underwater, in diving equipment, because they think that that's really funny. Okay, and there's nothing in the church regulations about this, but they are still getting married. It's still the institution. It's just articulated in a different way, and it's the same thing, In France, they have this Académie Française, which guards the language and the purity of it. But there are many people in France who speak very poor French, or they have dialects. Okay, but that doesn't mean that there isn't the language as a system, the one that you meet if you want to study French, and you study grammar books and things like that. Okay. The subjunctive, that sort of thing. So it's still there. So my point is simply that if you meet some instance of performance, some performance, and you think it's really crazy, it doesn't make sense, then you ask the people involved, or some of the locals, whatever, their family, bystanders, whatever, they say, what is this? Well, they're underwater, but it's a marriage. Okay? It's a wedding. Then you can see that, two people diving and so on counts as, okay, so it counts as some articulation of that institution. So
like the correspondence system is changing, but
yes.
the meaning still.
Well, yes. Anything, I would say, any bit of behavior that can be said to be X counters Y has an institution somewhere behind it that will provide some sort of, human sense or meaning into that. And so you can say, that is, it's not being spoken, but it can be verbalized post hoc because, now we know. It counts as this and that. So, and I was going to introduce here something about 4E cognition and things, but I left that out. Okay, so, but I really get your point.
I have 4 people who want to ask a question, but we have only 4 minutes, so the one who raised his hand first gets the chance, and others have to ask during coffee break or lunch. Or
hello. Yeah, my name is Abhirup, and I work with indigenous communities from India, and also with Sanskrit and Hinduisms. So I have a question, and probably one offering towards this. But my question is based on the statement, one statement that was there on your slide, where you were talking that deontic grids are the territories that scholars can actually map. And then a bit below that, you wrote that outsiders can know more than insiders. So what I wanted to ask is, who is an outsider, who is an insider, who decides that? Does it follow under this deontic grid that you are trying to develop? Can it actually change, modify as you work with the people? And finally, in that very same statement, who decides what is the knowledge? Like, when you say outsiders can know more than the insiders, so what is this knowing, what is the knowledge? Is the map equivalent to the knowledge, or do you have something else that is there someone who decides what knowledge is? And that's my question. And the offering is basically like, if I look at this circle of the deontic grid, and I think that, if we look at it in a context-specific manner, like if you look at it in particular context, then we can actually develop it into a more nuanced grid where we understand that, privilege, demand, offer, duty, they can actually interact in different ways with each other, not in a linear, circular or circumferential manner, and they can actually, modify in the grid over time. So that's my question is basically who decides what knowledge is and who is an outsider and an insider. So, thank you.
The best I can say is that it's entirely context dependent. It is. I mean, in some cases, there is no difference between insiders and insiders can also be outsiders. You can be born into a tradition and you can become an expert in an academic field concerning that tradition. And for instance,
a short answer is
yes.
good answer, so that people can go
Yes.
to lunch. But
Yes.
let's applaud Jeppe one more time for his interesting
Yes.
presentation.